Hello, everyone. Welcome to our design journal. I hope everyone's having a great evening and had a great week. This week, we've got a lot of cool stuff to talk about, as always. We're going to be talking just a little bit about some of the news, the things that are going on right now, so you guys know what's happening. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the progress that we've made. We are, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to talk about the feedback you guys all gave me about the last week's design challenge because it's a massive amount of feedback. You guys really got into this one, and I am still sort of parsing it all and assembling it. So I might have to do like a special post where we talk about the feedback that all of you gave. It was very cool stuff, and I can't wait to talk more about it. You'll remember the last one was about ways of advancement, coming up with cool means of advancement that don't actually advance your character, which sounds a little crazy. And that was actually part of the initial conversation was, what does that mean? How does that even look? And that was part of the challenge, right? We wanted you guys to think outside the box on this one and think of new and different ideas. So let me talk a little bit first about the news on what's going on. We've started our newsletter. If you haven't subscribed to the newsletter, I will put up a post. I will post the link here for you guys so that you can all grab it and get on board. The newsletter is one way on the mailing list that we're going to be keeping in touch with everyone to give them all the latest information on what's happening. Obviously, we'll post on Discord, we'll post on Facebook. Those groups are still out there and available. The links are available. If you go to coolnamerpg.com, you can always find our stuff there. So it's one recommendation. All the links are there. But yeah, sign up for the mailing list because that's a great way to get our regular newsletter that we just started. The first one went out today, in fact. Also, really important, late pledging is now open, which is huge. That is a huge thing. The late pledges, what that means, we actually just call it the pledge store. But what that means, and I'm going to put that link also into the comments, is that if you missed it, or more importantly, probably all of you have backed, but if one of your friends has missed it, or and you're like, sorry, man, it's over, now they have a chance to get in. And the more people we get to pledge through the pledge manager, we can use all of that money for art, additional time with our consulting designers and things like that. So that'll be very cool as well. So we bring more and more people on board as we get this thing rolling. It's another chance for us to add even more to it. And when I say art, to be really clear, this is art that we'll put into the content that's going to be free to the world. So we're not talking about special art that'll only be in the Masterwork edition. That's something else. We're talking about art specific to that version that we're giving out to everybody. So that's a really important point to keep in mind and to check it out. And if you have backed and you go to your survey and you're like, man, I should have backed for the higher one so I get the Masterwork hardcover or something, you can up your pledge there as well, which is cool. So that's all happening. Very, very cool. Lots of things going on. Let me take a look. Discord, mailing list, checking my checklist, make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, and if you're watching, make sure to subscribe. All right. Really important to subscribe to the YouTube channel because that's another way that you'll get notifications and information as we're going along. All right. So hello to everyone tonight. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited as we start talking about all of our design discussions for tonight. I am very pleased to welcome Crystal Mazur, one of our consulting designers. Very excited to have her here with us so that we can learn more about you and talk design with you. So thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you for having me on.
So can you tell folks who maybe, if they don't know your work, what are some of the things that you've worked on in the past?
So I worked on the PIP system core book, which is actually the second project that I've ever done for the RPG space. I was one of the main writers for it, and then I ended up becoming the lead developer for it when it won an Emmy in 2018. If you are unfamiliar with the Emmys, it is kind of like the Oscars for role-playing games.
Yep. And that's the book there. That's the PIP system core book.
That's the core book right there. Yeah. It is actually designed by Eloy Lasanta, who is an amazing writer, and he's also one of the consulting designers here.
Yeah.
So after that, I ended up being asked to work on Chicago by Night, which is for the Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition.
Oh, awesome.
And from there, I was also able to get onto Let the Streets Run Red. I am actually from Milwaukee.
If you're doing Chicago by Night, I was like, are you from Chicago?
I'm not from Chicago. Well, okay, so I am not from Chicago, but I visit Chicago enough.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
and in Let the Streets Run Red, I actually get to I actually got to update Milwaukee by Night
Oh, nice.
for it in a little splat, which was awesome. And I also brought in Indianapolis into
Oh,
the World of
excellent.
Darkness officially. So um and then I also worked on for Vampire 5th edition. I worked on the player's guide, which is in pre-orders right now.
Hmm.
And so I got to do a whole bunch of design work from there. I've also worked on Never Going Home, which
Hmm.
is from Wedding Games. It is World War I eldritch type horror, and I've written in every single one of their Kickstarters for it,
Oh,
starting
that's
at the
awesome.
beginning. So
Did they win a any too?
they were nominated for an Art
Okay.
Any, because I backed their Kickstarter before I was ever asked to write on the project
Uh-huh.
because of the art.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then and it's all done by the same artist, which if you've never heard of Charles Ferguson Avery
Hmm.
Ferguson, he is an amazing artist, and he does all of the art for Never Going Home. He's actually the only artist that we have on that project.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
Um
very cool.
yeah, I've also done a whole bunch of uh 5e stuff. So I
Hmm.
wrote some warlock stuff for Snowhaven, which
Hmm.
is a snowpunk scenario.
Oh, cool.
And I've worked on the Red Opera and Black Ballad, which was just on Kickstarter almost at the same time. It kind of coincided a little bit with Cool Name Goes Here. So
Well, that's awesome. I mean, you've worked on a boatload of stuff along the way.
yes,
And
yeah, I have.
what I think is interesting, what I'm excited about is that folks like you looking at your work, you've worked on a lot of things that are
Mhm.
very different from sort of the
Yeah,
standard run of the mill, traditional, I guess would be a better way to put it. Because traditional stuff, it's the stuff I play. So run of the mill maybe isn't the right word from it. I love that stuff. Um, but I think what's cool is that, for example, a little while back we had Steve Long on, right? And he's worked on the hero system. You've worked on the PIP system, which they're very different systems, right?
yep.
And I just love that we've got people bringing very different ideas. Can you tell us a little bit about the design of the PIP system? Like, what was the thinking? I know that Eloy Lasanta is the person who is the
Yeah.
primary designer, but what are some of the ideas, the design goals that went into that?
Okay. So the PIP system actually started out with Aloy wanting to storytell for his kids.
Hmm.
And one of his kids, and he has talked about this before in the past, but one of his kids has autism.
Hmm.
And so he needed something that his son would be able to kind of wrap his head around to be able to play, but he also wanted something engaging for his daughter to be able to play as well at the same time. So
Hmm.
he actually designed the PIP system. So essentially what the PIP system is that um the player is in control of all of the dice rolls.
Hmm.
And you roll d6 dice. Fours, fives, and sixes are successes. Now you have the player dice, and they're designated as in the book white dice. And then you have the opposing dice, which are designated as like black dice. We did a color system, but you can also do like player and opposing, stuff like that. It's pretty flexible when you explain it, but for
Yeah.
consistency's sake, we used colors.
And let me just ask before you go too much
Yeah,
further, that you're saying the player has the handful of both the opposing and the target,
correct.
and they're rolling them all. So it's a system that takes the rolling away, not takes it away, moves it from the GM to the players. So the GM is focused more on story. Is that sort of the
Yeah,
idea?
for the most part, whenever I storytell PIP system, I do occasionally roll dice.
Hmm.
And like if I'm playing with younger kids, I will roll the opposing dice because sometimes
Sure.
they get a whole handful of dice and their hands are really, really tiny. So
Yeah.
so I will help out. But yes, essentially that is actually put into the hands of the players.
Hmm.
And the fours, fives, and sixes count as successes on both sides of the dice.
Okay.
So what you end up doing is you end up collecting all of the dice that have fours, fives, and sixes, lining them up, and see which one has more.
Mm-hmm. So
And yeah.
I'm sorry if I apologize because I'm like I've got questions. I'm like, wait,
No,
wait,
no,
I have
no,
a
no, no,
question about
absolutely.
it.
Go right ahead.
So okay, so there was a while back. You probably saw a big semi truck drove under a bridge that was too low,
Yep,
and it
yep,
exploded billions of D6s out the back, and
yep,
those ended up being all over the internet of gaming nerd internet that I
yep.
follow, all over my internet, saying things like just rolled my Shadowrun attack roll, you know? What do you do like in a pool system? Because we've talked about dice pools as being a
Yeah.
possibility for Cool Name. How do you keep that from becoming getting out of hand, right? How do you keep that under control so you don't end up with that, too many dice pool
Absolutely.
situation?
Yeah, absolutely. That can be a problem. One of the things that is really, really nice is that the abilities and the skills and the qualities that characters have are capped off at 5.
Okay.
And so you can have more than 5 dice. On like average for most rolls is about 4 to 5 dice in general within the pip system. But you can have more if your character is specialized in something.
Yeah.
um I've also played around with rules such as different ways for characters to help each other and how that might look with dice. And so the GM actually has a lot of control over what is added to those dice.
Yeah.
And so as a GM, if you're seeing that a character has like 10 dice in their hand but only 3 opposing, with the pip system there are ways for you to be able to adjust things, but also like the goal of the pip system isn't to slaughter everybody. Like it
Yeah.
errors more in favor of the player than it does in an opposition of the player,
Yeah.
and that's done by design.
And so that actually brought me to one of my questions as well is coming up not this week but in a
Mhm.
future week. I have a weekly design challenge for folks, and you guys are going to get a little bit of a heads up on it so you can start thinking about it. Head start for everyone who's listening today. um, I want to talk about the whole challenge of scale,
Mhm.
where you've got the difference between a dragon and then a player.
Yep.
And even though you want them to be able to have that fight, there is that logical scale that comes into play where you're like, well, how come the dragon's only got 2 more points than my guy? That doesn't make sense to me. He should be way stronger than me.
Yep.
How do you represent scale in the pip system?
So within the pip system, enemies all have basically a set dice pool. So they
Hmm.
don't really have a full character sheet. Your character has stuff that's broken down, that's kind of
Hmm.
it's that one's the part of the is the crunchy part.
Yeah.
Um and the what they're called extras are the NPC characters or the bad guys. Um Within pip system we call them extras. The extras actually have what's called a challenge rating, and the challenge rating is anywhere between 1 and 10.
Hmm.
10 essentially being like Godzilla,
Okay.
and that is their dice pool. Their challenge rating is their dice pool. So
Hmm.
Godzilla will always have 10 for everything that it rolls,
Hmm.
whether it's doing a social thing or whether it's doing a physical thing.
Because look, if Godzilla asks you for something, you give it to him, right?
Yeah.
You don't argue.
You don't really ask questions on Godzilla. You can try to ask questions on Godzilla. There's always a percentage chance, but it may not work very well in your favor.
Right.
And then there are also like abilities. Like I think Godzilla has like a stomp ability where he can
Hmm.
actually burst his dice. So anything that's a 6, he can actually re-roll those and get even more successes because he's Godzilla.
Right.
So our scale is between there, and that's why we also have skills and qualities within the characters. The player characters are also capped at 5, which
Hmm.
means that if a player is really skilled in both a skill and a quality and they mash them together, they're going to generally just have those 10 dice unless they also have magic or something, because magic technically breaks everything that it touches. That's the whole point of
Yeah.
magic. you know. So but the basic characters that don't have magic will always have 10, and then there may be some other things that you can add into there or try to negotiate.
Hmm. So, what we're talking a lot about the PIP system. What game
Hmm.
got you into role playing games? Like, what was the game that someone sat you down and said, "You got to try this. This is going to be super cool." Just sit down and we'll show you. What was the game?
It was Vampire the Masquerade.
Oh, all right.
Yep,
Vampire.
it was
Excellent.
revised edition.
Okay.
Yeah, I it was in my junior year of high school. My boyfriend at the time and my best friend, we were all in band together, and we had just finished our marching season, and we weren't
Hmm.
sure what to do in between marching season and pep band season. And they were like, "Well, we were playing like role playing. Let's game and play vampire." And so they sat me down because they're like, "Hey, you're going to love this."
Uh
and, and made me make a character, and they were absolutely right.
huh. So with vampire, since we want to talk about some design
Yeah.
stuff here, with vampire, what were some of the design elements that, looking back on it as a designer today, you look back on it and you think that was clever. I liked how that worked, or that felt good in the game. What were some of the things that just spoke to you that when you think back on them now?
So I think one of the things that I really, really liked about the like the revised edition, because there's things I like about almost every single edition for Vampire. I've played even first edition. Um, And one of the things that I do like is the fact that as your character grows more powerful, you get more dice. And so there is
Hmm.
that physical aspect of having that growth in that character. And
Yeah.
then you getting to see that come alive onto the table.
So I'm gonna and I like that because that's a visceral feeling, right? It's not
Hmm.
just numbers on a page.
Yeah.
It's a visceral sense that you look at it. And I think that that's important. I mean, the way the human mind thinks, that sort of a visceral experience, it's part of why I think weird dice types work so well, right? Why I personally like them, because they have like this weird, almost arcane feeling to them, that when you're
Yeah.
picking up a different die type, you're having these sorts of experiences. Now, I just want to say James Nedham says hi. So first off, I wanted to
James,
pass that
hi!
along.
You made it.
And then Zero the Blade, hey, nice to see you back again. And he was saying he never thought he was going to like tabletop RPGs, but now he's got like binders of characters for all different games. So,
But
right?
let me tell you that I also never thought I was going to like RPGs. And yeah, that is like entire a second job for me. So
Right. So, what I was going to ask about, it's funny we were talking about advancement. So I'm going to share a little bit about, you may have seen it, but one of the things we were talking about was this idea that in a lot of movies, in a lot of books, the character never actually advances.
yeah,
James Bond is not any better at being James Bond in the 12th movie than in the first movie, right? Same thing
yeah,
with Indiana Jones. It's not like he's really developed as a character in stats. His story is developed over time, right? He's got inner counters and people he connects with and things. And yet in role-playing games, it seems like there's this expectation of growth. Do you have any thoughts on, why that is, or maybe why that's important to players as they're playing it? Is it just because we're used to it? Or do you think that that's something that is important to the experience?
so I'm going to interject this little thought, is that not every single RPG has growth or progression for
True.
characters.
Yeah.
And some of those games are the best games out there.
Hmm.
You get just a set character sheet and it doesn't change, and it forces you to be a little bit more creative with your character when it comes to solving problems. And I think that's where James Bond shows
Hmm.
his growth, is he gets more and more clever with things
Hmm.
and using the tools around him in order to solve his problems. But I feel like it's math.
Uh-huh.
It really, but that's the reason why people like to see and feel number growth, is because when you see a larger number, that triggers stuff in your brain that makes it feel like it's right, because we've been trained as a
Mhm.
society where if your bank account is large, you feel pretty good about yourself. Your paycheck is large, your pay per hour is large. That
Right.
discount that you
Your
got,
score gets
your
is higher.
score in
That's how you win,
sports.
right?
Yeah. And so like we
Most
have
sports.
been, most sports.
Yeah.
And so except for golf, but you
Yeah.
go the
That's
opposite
what
way
I'm
on
thinking.
that one.
We'll leave golf out of that. We said sports. So sorry to all the golf players out there.
But I feel like it's the math thing. It's like the exponential growth. You know, like you like to see those numbers go up because it shows that you are accomplishing something, and it is a math way to reward that.
Mhm.
And so like your brain may not like math, or you may think that you don't like math. You actually do like math. You
Yeah.
just don't realize it.
Well, and I think for this group, you're preaching to the choir, right? Anyone who's listening right now is probably like going, "Wow, yeah, math is awesome. I'm all for math."
I
You
love
know,
math.
Joseph Keenan was saying, says the reward juice exchange, right? I think that part
Yeah.
of it is that whole, there is sort of that dopamine
Mhm.
return you get on seeing that. And that's a way to do it. And I will say that I don't believe, and just for folks who are worried, because I've been asking these questions, whenever I ask weird philosophical design questions, people are like, is that what you're building? I'm like, we're not building that. It's just we're thinking outside the box to get cool ideas,
Yeah.
but the whole idea here is that, you know, I think that for Cool Name RPG, we're probably going to have some manner of player advancement. It's something that people love. It's something that people want. At my own game table last night, we were testing out a few things for Cool Name, that just playing with some ideas. And I almost got a revolt when I said, so what do you think about this? And they're like going, no, screw you. We're going to have this. It's shut up, man. No. So I got shut down pretty hard, but I would love to someday see if you can't generate the same sort of positive response from people with something else, right? I think it would be a really cool thing to experiment with and see some other people who have done that.
I would give a game suggestion for that, because there is one that kind of has it. It still has character advancement, but the character advancement is very different. It's not based on XP.
Hmm.
It's based on your connections to other characters and
Mm.
how those advance through the story. And that's Apillion, where you play
Okay.
baby dragons.
Oh, that's
And
cool.
your clutch only gets better when they work together. And when those relationships fall apart, everybody actually suffers from it.
Yeah. It's a good point. That is a very cool thing where you get rewarded for putting those together, and it's not necessarily about changing your character.
Yeah.
Richard Lee Byers pointed out that one advantage of character growth from a purely practical point of view is that it allows the game master to change up the types of enemies that you're facing. And so from a
Absolutely. Yep.
purely practical point of view, you don't have to have another goblin adventure, right? It's at some point you can only fight goblins so many times before someone's like going,
There are
can we
only
just
so many kobolds in trench coats that we can have.
right? At some point, they're just going to be like, no. Um, Now, James pointed out that there are movie characters, though, who did advance, like Luke Skywalker. We watched
Yeah.
Luke advance through the films. The other thing is that Spider-Man advanced. But I think what's interesting, and Stephen Shen was bringing up just now, talking about Marvel superheroes a little bit. In that system, you developed power stunts as opposed to necessarily growing more powerful. So the Human Torch, for example, when you play the Human Torch at the lowest level, he fires a fire blast. But as he gets up, he's like, learns how to make a wall of fire around the enemies, right? Now,
Yeah.
that's a completely different sort of action. And that's a type of growth without actually upping the power level of the character, which I think is an interesting approach.
I'm gonna use a video game reference here,
Yeah.
but Diablo and Diablo 2 specifically has the point tree buy, where you have to put your points into certain powers in order to advance on the tree, and you can't like if you don't put enough powers or enough points into a certain thing, you can't buy the next thing down.
Hmm.
But it allows you to specialize in a whole bunch of different things,
Hmm.
in ways that you want your character specifically to grow. So if you want like all fire, you're going to put all your points in fire, and that's where it's going to
Yeah.
be. But if you want like fire and you also want, some sort of like mind movement or telekinesis or something like that, you're going to have to buy on a different tree and you're going to have to
Hmm.
manage those. So that's a
Yeah.
different type of character advancement where it's not necessarily XP. It's more of, the storyteller says that you have reached a point now in the story where you can have this many points to spend on your trees.
It's
So,
interesting when you talk about having your trees. One cool idea that came up, and I apologize to the person whose idea it was because that's why I'm going to have a special session just to talk about the responses. But someone said, "What if you just altered where your points were spent each time you went up each time you leveled or hit a milestone?" They go, "It represents your character dropping off the old things that no longer matter and refocusing on the new things." So as a person, just like in real life, we change, and the things like I do not know is I still love dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are awesome. Utahraptor is my favorite still, in case anyone ever wonders. Do you have a favorite dinosaur, Crystal?
Triceratops.
Okay, it's good. I just
Yep.
wanted to make sure to ask. Um, so but I know less about them now than I did before, but I know more about medieval history. And they said, well, that's another way you could grow as a character, is sort of refining your knowledge areas into areas that are more useful, which I thought was kind of cool.
Or like if you have a specific fight that you know is coming up, your
Hmm.
character is going to be researching that stuff. And so you're going to be allocating your time and your effort and your, the limited amount of bandwidth that you have to those certain areas. So temporarily you could be, uh a expert in time manipulation or time
Yeah.
jumping, and your brain can wrap its head around the whole you and accidentally create a time loop because
Yeah.
you always do when you time jump.
Right. I have to say I've got a superhero world that I'd someday like to release out there, but I'm just flat out going to remove time travel and mind control because I'm reading all the Marvel comics. I started with Fantastic Four #1. I'm up to 1978, and I'll tell you, with you take those two things out, and 90% of the chaos that erupts unnecessarily in worlds would go away. But that's
Yep.
something else. I'm nerding out about Marvel stuff again because we started talking about it. One thing that came up, and I'm sort of wondering what you think, especially thinking about PIP system.
Yeah,
Michael D pointed out that math can sometimes be a barrier to entry for some
it can.
for
Yep.
some players. You know, what do you think about that? I mean, where have you seen that, and how do you see overcoming that?
um so I will say it can be a barrier to entry if there is not accommodations.
Hmm.
So, for instance, if you have somebody who has dyscalculia, where the numbers just do not make sense in their head, they flip around, they
Yeah.
rotate, um, you as a community need to help and accommodate that person. I'm a special education teacher, so this is my jam.
Oh, all right. There we go.
um but like if or somebody tells you like I am not good at math and this is like my brain just cannot handle math, then you as a community, as your small table, need to kind of rally around that person and kind of help them when they need it. But I will say that even those that struggle with math, if you continually do the same things over and over and over and over again in math, it becomes a habit
Hmm.
rather than a task. And
Hmm.
then eventually the math will get easier. I'm not saying that's for everybody because there are some people who just cannot get their heads around math. And
Hmm.
and that is a very real reality for them. Um but for a good majority of people with support, they would be able to do that stuff. Um when it comes to things like accommodations, that's where things like color coding dice,
Hmm.
so color coding the sides or inking the sides differently might become handy. Things like um, comes to making it more complicated, having actual formulas in printed in the book for it. So, for instance, the biggest one was um, when I first started RPGs, mechanics were not my thing.
Hmm.
Totally different now, but there are reasons for that. Vampire had this great thing where it told you you take your attribute and you take your abilities, you add them together and you roll that many dice. So it had the formula actually written
Hmm.
in there. And then the character sheet was also like designed in um a scaffolded way where you know that you take this box and then you add this box. And then you might have a add, any other disciplines. And that might be in parentheses because you may not always be using disciplines,
Hmm.
right? So every dice roll had attribute plus ability. And then sometimes you had disciplines, or sometimes you may have willpower. And that formula was written there as, you do your willpower and it's just the willpower roll, or you
Yeah.
do your willpower plus this about ability modifier, or whatever the case may be. So providing as much scaffolding, that's what the educational term is, scaffolding, so
Uh-huh.
that people can follow right along up there to be able to do this independently,
You know,
or
I
with
think
some help.
I think that though, you're talking about things that really benefit any player, really,
Yep.
in a lot of ways. What you're talking about is good information design. This
Yep.
is something I believe it was Robin Laws who brought it up, and for hopefully Ken will forgive me if it was him, but he talked about the importance of information design because if you think about our
Mhm.
Toma requirements, we have this idea that the game should be able to play it like the idea that was brought up that people want to interact with the other players, not necessarily with the rule book, right? Not that people
Yeah.
don't want to look at the rule book, but that when you're at the game table, you want to be playing, right? You don't want to be everyone stops, story stops, all the characters freeze as you sit there and
Absolutely.
look. You want to be able to move forward. And he talked about the importance of information design, and part of what you're talking about sounds a lot like that,
It
right?
is. So,
Yeah.
so here's the secret to special education is that there is nothing actually special about it because everybody can actually benefit from some
Yeah.
of the stuff that I do. Really what it is it's I am an accessibility specialist
Hmm.
within my field, which means that I can take the math or the English or the science or the social studies and I can adjust it so that my students are able to understand it at their level.
Hmm.
Um and so this is essentially the same thing. So you take the information and the math, which like I don't know many RPGs, if any, actually give like the percentage breakdowns of this is your percentage chance of this, or this is your percentage chance of this. Um, I think maybe GURPS might be the
Unless it's a
closest.
percentile based system. I mean, unless it's
Yeah.
percentile based, right? For the most part, they don't
Yeah.
go into it. Occasionally, I think the old first edition books had some bell curves and showed how your distribution might turn out because at the time they were like, "Oh, this is awesome. Yeah, here's some math."
But
But for the
but think
most
about
part,
the barrier of entry to that because
yeah,
you're showing math and stuff like that, which for us that can wrap our heads around it is awesome. I love
yeah,
seeing that stuff. I love seeing like the spread of percentages and everything like that and probability tables and all of that stuff, but I can wrap my head around that. If you want your game to be accessible to everybody, you put that stuff on a special place for all of the math people to go off and go nerd off on their own. Um, like
yeah.
your website or, an article that you have written or something like that where it's accessible still, but it's not the core part of what you're putting out there
Yeah.
because that is a huge turnoff for a lot of people that are like, nope, that seems like too much math and I want to play a game. So I'm going to go roll dice and play Monopoly.
So it's interesting because a lot of what we've been talking about and a lot of what's been happening behind the scenes right now are discussions about how do you create a system that allows people to lock on new functionality, to
Yeah,
modularize to a certain extent, and yet still works at the most basic level. And there has got to be some underlying math there for that. But kind of what we're looking at is how do we keep the game simple? And then, like you said, say, now, for those of you who really want to get into this, let's break it down, right? Let's talk through how this works. And I mean, there are even things that we've been talking about that aren't even so much math, but actually just get into theory on how people think, like the difficulties we were discussing. We were discussing this concept of having 5 named difficulty levels. And the
Yep.
reason being is that one of the things that comes up in agile software development, and I talk about software all the time, and everyone's probably sick of it, but it is my day job, so I do this a lot. One of the things that comes up is the idea that human beings, even ones who love math, like programmers, fail to make good numerical assessments.
Oh yeah,
If you ask them
absolutely.
to make a numerical assessment, they struggle. If you ask them to say, is this as big as an elephant or as small as a mouse? And you're like, oh, interesting. Well, I'm not sure. You say, well, the last job was as big as a dog. And they go, well, it's definitely smaller than a dog. And that you can think about.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting sharing that information so that people can start implementing things based on that, right?
I think and I'm actually really like super excited that you have Ken Haidt
Yeah.
as one of the consulting designers, because not only is he one of the original vampire writers, right?
Yeah.
But he's also did most of the design work for the Vampire 5th edition.
Yeah.
And I will say that as much as people kind of railed against it, one of the most brilliant design aspects that he adjusted was your blood pool
Hmm.
and hunger dice. And the fact that being low on blood now actually has a mechanical consequence. And he did it in such a way where it still follows that attribute plus ability plus your hunger dice, or
Hmm.
adjusting with your hunger dice. And it doesn't take away from the original mechanics, but it adds so much more to that game in a way that I don't think people realized until they started seeing people actually play it.
Right.
And that was, I think, one of the most brilliant moves that could have happened for 5th edition. And before people started playing it, people were rallying against it and trying to be like, this was the worst thing ever. And I was sitting there like, I actually don't think so. I
Yeah.
want to see it, but I actually think this is brilliant. And sure enough, like
Yeah.
watching everybody play it, I was like, yes, this actually works so much better. And it doesn't take away from the old feel of the game at
You
all.
know, that some of that gets into the theories expounded, and there's a book, I think it's called Who Moved My Cheese? And it's just about the human psychological reaction to change. And it has to
Oh,
do with
yeah.
change management and how do you manage
Okay.
change for people. But let me go ahead. I want to bring in some of the comments that folks are
Oh,
making.
yeah, absolutely.
Here's one of the things that came up. Milestone advancement rocks and removes a lot of accounting to produce relatively straightforward effects. You know, I personally end up, even when the only time I've really been hardcore about XP is when we played Hackmaster 4th edition, and the goal was to play it raw, you know, as written, hardcore, that if it was in the rules, it was real, and if it wasn't in the rules, and you could get around it and stuff. But other than that, we generally always fall back on milestone advancement. I don't know if you have any thoughts about
I love
milestone versus
milestones.
crunching it. Yeah.
I love milestone. And coming from Vampire, I never actually played D&D until 3.5, and I literally played 2 games of 3.5 before they announced 4th edition. And so so and I played a little bit of 4th edition too, and then I moved into 5th edition. And trying to wrap my head around going from Vampire to what D&D uses for advancement was
Yeah.
really hard for me, even with a math brain. I was like,
Yeah.
I don't understand this. This is so confusing. And so like milestone advancement for me works so much better because it removes the math barrier,
Mhm.
and you can as a GM then pace out exactly where you want certain encounters to be.
You know, there is a good something to be said, though, and this has come up in a lot of our conversations on the concept of point buy advancement, where
I do
it's sort
like
of
point
a la
buy
carte,
too.
right?
Yep.
So as you go along, you can just sort of buy a little of this and a little of that, and your character sort of grows organically over time. I actually kind of like that as well. That's another thing that I think is cool. In both cases, though, I think one of the challenges is making sure that you're rewarding people for the behaviors that are supposed to be central to the game, because people are going to do whatever you reward them for. And
Yep.
what's interesting is a lot of people don't realize the importance of gold in original D&D in terms of experience. Every gold piece was an experience point if you took it from something dangerous, but you didn't have to kill it. You could steal it. You could sneak in and take it. You could knock them out. There wasn't a sense that you had to murder everything. And quite frankly, the experience points for killing most things were so much lower than just taking their treasure that you didn't really feel as bloodthirsty as the murder hobo, situation that people talk about. But yeah, it lets you sort of shape how you reward people. And milestone advancement is about rewarding people for accomplishing story goals versus murderizing everything in the countryside. Because at that point, if you're going to get experience points for killing everything, you are looking at that cow going, they don't need a cow, but I could use the XP right now.
Right. Yeah, the squirrel points are that's what we call them, is that if you kill someone inconsequential, you just get a squirrel point, and then
So another thing that came up, Doug Kilmer said, I would like to see an advancement system that provides adventure group advancement, whether group skill or talent. And I think this is a really cool idea. And a couple of people were thumbs upping it as we were talking about it.
I kind of like that idea too.
Yeah.
I feel like there should be like if there is like something like that, with like character trees, except for things like group works better together with.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, maybe you work better underwater together because, that's just how everybody clicks.
Shit, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Or like you are performing troop.
Mm-hmm.
So yours is performance based and not, you may be able to use some of that for some sort of combat, but maybe not. Who knows?
But then it's like when that group gets together to run a con, I mean, how fun is that, right?
Oh,
at that
God,
point,
yeah.
they're gelling. They've got the skills for that. I think that's a very cool idea. Another thing, let's see, Michael D. Grady brought up, quoting, every complex system that works has been built on a simple system that works. And I think that is absolutely true. Like one of the things we did talk about is in our discussion about attributes is this concept of exploding attributes, where you boil them down to the core concept of what makes up the character, and that's enough to play with. But beyond that is this system of complexity that you can dig down into if that's your thing. And I think it's a pretty good statement. And I'm not sure who the original source is either, but it's a good point.
One of the things that you can absolutely do is take a look at a system. And if you want to figure out the base of that system, take away all the magic and all the special abilities and just look at the basic dice. If you were just rolling to just be a dude, what is that? And that is your system. Everything else is built around to break the rules of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, that's awesome. Let's see, Stephen Shen, who had some great things to say, he knows a little bit about D&D. I don't know, one or two things, like all the D&D and AD&D books that he edited over the years. But it could have been so much bigger if it had been more information accessible, because I wasn't a war gamer. I didn't grok the 1E rules because it was jargon heavy and made assumptions of what readers knew. And I think that it's interesting because on one hand, I agree with him, but on the other hand, that's part of what made it so special to those of us who are playing 1E, is it was this special place that no one else understood, the language, our own secret coded language. I wonder how important that is to the game design. Like when you talk about vampire, there's a lot of that, right?
So here is what I will say about that, is that 1E is its own entity. At this point within the history of our entire gaming history, right?
Yeah.
1E was the original, and holding it up to something like that with some of the other stuff that has happened in the past, like Vampire having a literal dictionary at the beginning of every single book of all of the new terms.
Right.
The accessibility of that information was not first and foremost on the minds of the designers, because at that point it hadn't actually gotten to the point of that being a problem.
Yeah.
And so D&D 1E kind of stands alone when it comes to some of that stuff. And I'm not giving it like a blanket pass on everything, but
Yeah.
specifically the accessibility, especially in that time frame too. If you look at society, their accessibility was not a thing. Like even when I was in high school, the special education students were kept away from everybody. They had their
Yeah.
own classroom and in a different part of the school, and I rarely ever saw them. Now I'm moving into classes to teach my students and to help them access the exact same stuff that the other students are doing.
Got it.
And so it's advanced so far, and then that also means that the stuff that's coming out now is also advancing along with us, probably maybe at a slower pace because publishing is its own beast right there, but it's slowly following along. And so yes, it absolutely would have been nice. Would I actually like to see someone take the 1E rules and kind of translate all of that? Absolutely. I think
Well,
that'd
and
be
I
kind of
think some of
cool, like
that's
a
been
cool
done,
project.
right? I
Has it
mean,
been?
some of the old school stuff that's out right now, I forget what's the one that's like, it's at like $1 million right now. It's a ridiculous Kickstarter. Yeah, if I could just remember the name. If
Oh,
anyone knows the one I'm talking about, it's all black and white. It's old school. It is just like going out of control. Maybe it's even over now. But I guess the thing that I think is interesting and I worry about sometimes is that we put so much thought into creating well-crafted, refined, polished, well thought out systems. I wonder sometimes how much we're underestimating the importance of the weird cult mentality of that is founded on that sort of arcane stuff, because like the rules of first edition were all so weird and disconnected half the time
mm-hmm.
that it was like you had a book of magic, right?
Yep.
Because and if you could learn it, oh my god, you could unlock the secrets. We lose some of that once we make the games really well designed, and you're kind of like going, yeah, it's all makes perfect sense, and it's easy to learn, and anyone can what happened, right? It's interesting.
Yeah. I feel like there are things that like some people are just never going to be able to wrap their head around
Yeah.
because that's human nature, right?
Yeah.
And so like we have to try and make sure that what we put out is accessible to as many people as we can in a
Hmm.
reasonable way.
Yeah. So that's what I guess that's what I'm saying is that I bet there's some place where you can get both. And I don't know that this is the
Yeah.
right project to do it, but I would love to see like a place where you can capture that sense of you are becoming part of something, right? Something that's unique and different and connects you with the people around you, and yet still makes sure that everyone can be part of it, right? Because to me,
Yeah,
that's part
absolutely.
of what D&D was about. It was about saying that, you know what, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter whether you're a football player. It doesn't matter whether you're the weird kid who sits out back by himself all day and everyone's like going, what's with that guy? But then he starts playing D&D and he's part of the team. He's part of the group. I mean, that's super important, I think. And I
Oh
think
yeah.
I'd like to just find that beautiful sweet spot between the thing where you're part of something magical that just falls outside of our own reality and yet still allows people in. So it's a challenge. That's like a good weekly design challenge at some point.
Yeah, it
So
does.
let's see what James says. I do appreciate how Fate and Chronicles of Darkness and a few other systems reward players for acting their character flaws and
Oh,
rewarding
absolutely.
short-term failures.
Yep.
Yeah, some very cool stuff. In fact, one of the things that came up was the importance of experience for failure. And I was like, that is so cool because that
Yep.
encourages people to try the crazy plan that they otherwise are going to be like, no, let's just go in the back the normal way. It's not,
Yep.
instead of doing the cool thing. And then Richard Lee Byer said, I think group advancement would be cool, but my players would want there to still be individual advancement too. They
Oh
all have
yeah.
their particular goals on how their individual characters will grow.
Yeah, I feel like if there would be group advancement, there
Yeah.
also has to be individual because everybody is not all the same.
Yeah, I agree
So
because
yeah,
and I
yes.
agree. I think that both those things are good to have. And then Michael said Fate and others have drives and flaws wrapped into their mechanics, which we were talking a little bit about with James. 5th edition has them too, but with no mechanical tie-in. So it's funny, they actually do, because the way that it's supposed to work as written is that those 4 things that you choose, your ideals, your flaws,
Yeah.
when you use them, that's how you earn your what's the word? The points. It's been a long day, folks. My brain's not working. The reroll dice points. You know what I'm talking about.
Hit points.
Not hit points.
Hit dice.
No, somebody help me out here. What are they called? I can't believe it has truly been a long day, but everyone knows what I'm talking about. When you get your one time you can use it to re-roll or something, right? That's what you're supposed to get those for. Inspiration. Thank you. Oh my God, it was on the tip of my tongue. Don't you hate that? Inspiration. Yes.
Yep. Everyone thinks that only the bard can get it. Not true.
Yeah, the inspiration comes from those 4 things, and it's written right in the rules that that's how you're supposed to use them. But a lot of people don't, because I actually did some surveying a while back when we were working on the World of Atalta stuff, and a lot of people are like going, yeah, we just stopped using those completely. They're mostly for the first day of the game, and then after that we ignore them, which I thought was an interesting piece that I wonder how much Wizards has picked up on in all of their work. So that's interesting. Yeah. So look, we are running low on time. We got about 9 minutes left. I told you this would happen, right? That we'd be talking, all of a sudden we'd be like, we got like 5 minutes left. Is there anything from a design perspective that you'd be really excited to see us explore, even if we don't necessarily do it? But what is an area that is near and dear to your heart? I mean, obviously accessibility is super important to you. And I think that I'm very excited to have your feedback on these things, because honestly, it seems like something like, yeah, I know what I'm doing, but there's some that you don't necessarily know what you're doing. You need to get people who know how to do it. But what else are an area where you're really excited to see us sort of explore?
I really, really like when there is something tangible, like for instance, the hunger dice in Vampire, where you're like, I know it's only a matter of time. Statistically, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I am going to I'm going to lose my cool. I'm going to avoid swearing because I don't know if this is 18 plus or not. But
it's not. This is, we consider this PG-13, so keep it at the PG-13 level.
I will keep it PG-13. So I'm going to lose my cool, at some point, because mechanics say that that's bound to happen.
Yeah.
And so, I love stuff that's tangible. One of the things that I love, Chill actually had a mechanic where in the center there was tokens, and you'd flip them one side if the players could use them. Mm-hmm. And then once the players use them, you flip it over to the other one, and the GM gets to use certain things for it.
Right. Yeah.
That had such a harrowing feeling on me when I played, where I was like, oh man, what is coming our way, because we are running low on tokens.
Yeah, and they're all like massed over here by the GM, and you're like going, oh dear. Yeah.
So awesome. I love tangible things like that, but also that have mechanics to them.
Cool. Well, we'll definitely have to give that some thought as we go along here. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. But Crystal, thank you so much for coming on tonight. This has been fun. It's so much fun to talk gaming stuff with everyone. So it's been great to get to talk to you a bit.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Sure thing. All right. Well, folks, we'll see you later, Crystal. And for everyone else, thank you for joining tonight. It's been awesome having you here. I am skipping our weekly challenge, and I'm sorry to do it to you, but like I said, there was so much advancement talk that we are going to have to focus on that, and we're going to have to take an extra week for that. So you still have time to get in on that challenge and talk about advancement with us. And even as we're talking, there's more cool new ideas coming up here. So thank you all. Have a great week. Play some great games over the weekend, and we will talk to you more soon. Talk to you all later.